Good morning. My name is Lisa Kent, and I am the Development Coordinator and Grant Writer for the State Historical Society of Iowa. Today I will be talking about the basics of grant writing. I have been writing grants for nearly 20 years, the last 8 working for the State Historical Society of Iowa, and I have worked on a wide variety of grants, ranging from animal health and STEM education to museum lighting and historic preservation. In my current role with the State Historical Society, I apply for grants to support the bureaus of the Society, including the State Historical Museum, State Historical Library and Archives, State Historic Preservation Office, and State Historic Sites. The State Historical Society does not and cannot apply for its own grant funding, so I do not complete applications for the Society's grant programs, and therefore I do not have a strong familiarity with those. But many of the tips I will offer today will be applicable to the Society's grant programs as well as other grants you may apply for. When looking for grant funding for your organization, there are a number of places to look for grant opportunities. I have pulled together a list of various organizations that either provide grants themselves or provide a listing of grant opportunities, and I have included their website addresses for your reference. Some of these are specific to Iowa, and some are national listings. As I mentioned, the State Historical Society offers a number of grant programs for Iowa organizations that can be found on our website at iowaculture.gov. The state of Iowa also provides a variety of grant opportunities, which you can find on their website at iowagrants.gov. In addition, Iowa Economic Development has a number of their own grant offerings for Iowa organizations. And as the name would suggest, the National Trust for Historic Preservation provides grants for organizations throughout the U.S. and is not just focused on Iowa. The following sites offer searchable listings of grants provided by other organizations. For example, the Iowa Nonprofit Resource Center has a database of grant opportunities focused on Iowa, whereas Candid is a national listing of grant opportunities. The Iowa Community Foundation site is a helpful resource to find grant opportunities offered by community foundations across the state of Iowa. These sites are searchable by location and type of project, which is very helpful. This is by no means meant to be an exhaustive list of grant resources, but it is definitely a good start. Once you have found the grant opportunity you are interested in applying for, it is important to thoroughly read the instructions to make sure your project is eligible and is well aligned with the grant criteria. As you read through the guidelines, think about things such as, is your project truly a good fit with the grant being offered? Have you done the planning necessary to be ready to apply? Does the timing of the grant work with your project? Are you capable of providing the matching funds or cost share that is required for that particular grant? And are you able to provide all of the documentation and information needed? As I mentioned, one thing that is important to think about is whether additional planning might be needed before you apply. Project planning is valued by granting organizations and grant reviewers. If your project is complicated or extensive, it is a very good idea to hire a professional to help you do planning before you apply. If you do that, be sure to mention it in the application, as it shows you've done your homework. If you determine that planning is necessary and it has not yet been done, you may be able to find a grant to support the planning phase of your project. Another thing to consider when applying is getting bids for your project. When vendor estimates are required, it's important to get bids and to source products from qualified and reputable vendors. When a contractor is needed, it's extremely important to identify a qualified and experienced contractor for the type of work that is being done, as it will assure the granting organization that the work will be done appropriately. Where possible, it's also a good idea to get 3 bids for any work needed. It shows the granting organization that you are doing your due diligence and will spend grant funds wisely. Most grant programs provide a contact person with an email address or phone number for questions. If you have questions about grant requirements, the application, or whether your organization or project is eligible to apply, reach out to this grant manager, as he or she can be very helpful as a resource to ask questions and obtain clarification. This can also be a great way for the granting organization to get to know you and become more familiar with your organization. That said, you want to be respectful of their time, so try to make sure you are not asking questions that were already answered in the application instructions provided. You can also reach out to the grant manager to ask for sample applications, as some granting organizations will provide them. And it can be very helpful to read through these sample applications, which are typically those from organizations that were awarded funding in prior years. Once you decide to move forward on applying for a grant opportunity, it's important to take steps to make sure you stay organized and on track with the application. One thing that is very helpful is to create a schedule for yourself and to share that with anyone else who is working on the application with you. Allow for more time than what you think is necessary, and be sure to factor in extra time for things like getting estimates from vendors, getting letters of support from partners or stakeholders, gathering budget information, and for obtaining a council resolution or some other type of approval that requires advanced planning. It is also helpful to have a checklist when you are working on a grant application. Some granting organizations provide a checklist for all the components of an application that are needed. This can be a very helpful tool to make sure you have all the components that are required. However, if there's no checklist provided, you can easily create your own. It is also helpful to create a folder on your computer where you put everything you need for the application. This will help you keep everything in one place so that you do not have problems finding the documents you have created and saved when it is time to submit your application. When you begin to write your application, it's important to note that the majority of applications are submitted through online grant application systems. Many of these systems will save your work for you. However, I find it extremely helpful to put the application questions into a Word document or a Google Doc and prepare the narrative there. This is a little extra work, but it has many advantages and benefits in the long run. First and foremost, it provides a backup of the application in case their system crashes. And yes, I have had this happen to me. This also makes it easier to do spell check, track edits by others, and check word or character counts if there is a limit on the length of the answers, which there usually is. I personally prefer using Google Docs as it allows for multiple people to add and edit text within the same document at the same time, which makes it much easier to track edits when you have multiple contributors. Google Docs also automatically saves the document for you, and it is very easy to use, and it is also free. There are a variety of things to consider as you write your application to make sure you are giving your project the best chance to be funded. First of all, it's important to realize that there are many worthy projects that will be applying for the same grant program. So you want to do your best to make a good case as to why your project should be funded and show that you have thought through the details. As you write the application, be clear and concise. Most applications have word or character limits to abide by, so it's extremely important that you are able to describe your project in a concise manner. It's also important to make sure that you are answering the questions asked rather than writing about what you think they want to hear. It is also important to familiarize yourself with the terminology. This doesn't mean you should be extremely technical in writing your application, but it's important to work with your staff or any professionals that are working on your project to make sure that the language you are using is appropriate. For example, you wouldn't talk about remodeling a historic home, but rather would be referencing the appropriate preservation terminology. In addition, where possible, it is good to briefly explain how the project fits into the larger mission of your organization. And you don't want to assume that the reviewers have ever heard of your resource or your organization, so be sure to provide some background information for them. It is also good to talk about the importance of your project and its potential impact on your audience and the public. In addition, make sure to illustrate why this project is the right one at this time for your organization by discussing what goals you have achieved that make your organization ready for this particular project. For example, if you are asking for funds to conserve a specific collection item, you could show how you've already addressed bigger concerns first, such as climate control or appropriate storage spaces and materials. Further, if you have community support for your project, it is important to show it by including those comments in your narrative and adding letters of support. It is also important that, where appropriate, you explain how your recommendations comply with professional standards of groups such as the National Park Service, the American Alliance of Museums, the American Institute for Conservation, the Society of American Archivists, or other professional groups. This is another area where you can use your staff or a professional you hire to assist you with the project to determine if you need to reference these kinds of professional standards in your project application. Another important aspect of the application is to clearly explain how your organization will be meeting the matching requirements and make sure the type and source of matching funds proposed is acceptable within the grant rules. For example, with most federal grant applications, you cannot use other federal dollars as a match. It's also important to create a strong project team. When identifying your project team, make sure you have an appropriate mix of professional skill sets and expertise to be successful. Be sure to bring in outside experts as necessary to fulfill project expertise requirements. In addition, where appropriate, it is helpful to explain how and when you will share the ongoing work of the project. This can be through your website or through social media platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can also look at ways to promote the project through local and regional media and share that in the application as well. As you are writing the application, try to think like a reviewer and ask yourself some questions such as, would I fund this project? Do I have confidence that we, as the applicant, know what we are doing and can finish the project successfully? Also, be sure to make it easy for the reviewer. Keep in mind that reviewers have to read a lot of applications. Don't make them have to sort through unnecessary details or spend too much time looking for the key pieces of information that they need to evaluate your project. Many applications require certain supplementary information be attached to the application, and they may also allow for you to attach additional items of your choosing. Some things you may want to attach include resumes of staff and vendors. Resumes normally must be no more than 2 pages each. You will also want to include copies of bids that you referenced in the application so reviewers can see where your numbers and information is coming from. It can also be a good idea to include relevant photos to support your project. Choose your photographs carefully and arrange them so that they tell your story. A clear and high-quality photo helps reviewers appreciate and understand your project better. Letters of support can also be very helpful to have from partners on the project or from leadership within your community or region. If you provide letters of support, be sure to give your writers enough notice. And keep in mind that some of your writers will simply copy what is in your email to them and make that their letter. Therefore, it's helpful to customize your emails to each person so that if this happens, they're not all copying the same text. You can also encourage them to customize the letter on their own. Providing identical letters from several people is not as strong as letters that each provide their own perspective on the project. Another thing to look for is that many grant programs provide a scoring rubric or a list of criteria the reviewers must use to evaluate the applications they receive. Keep in mind that reviewers are selecting grant applications that best meet their criteria, as they are deemed as the most likely to succeed. Therefore, it's important to respond to the narrative questions based on the reviewer criteria provided by the granting organization. After you are finished writing your application and before you submit it, you should have at least one other person review your application, but multiple reviewers is better. It's easy to lose perspective when you have been working hard on an application, and you may miss typos or other mistakes that a person with fresh eyes will notice. It's also good to have a second pair of eyes to make sure that you are not missing any key information and that you provided the big picture of the project. After you and others have reviewed your application and you are ready to submit, if you have created your narrative in a Google Doc or a Word document, you can easily copy and paste your responses into the online application form. I didn't get into a discussion of budgets today, as budget forms and requirements vary so widely between granting organizations. If the granting organization does not provide a budget form and detailed instructions, be sure to ask them for guidance on what your budget should look like. Then you can attach any required or optional supporting documents, such as resumes, bids, letters of support, and photos, as I talked about previously. Granting organizations normally provide a date for when they will make their award notifications. It's a good idea to reach out to them if you have not heard anything by that date, to see if they have made their funding decisions. If you don't get the news you are looking for and your project is not funded, be sure to ask for feedback. This feedback can be extremely helpful in strengthening your application for the next time you apply to the same organization or when applying elsewhere. It's definitely disappointing when your project is not funded, but try not to get discouraged. Most grant programs have many more applications than they have the money to fund them, so unfortunately, worthy projects can go unfunded. You can plan to apply again to the same grant program or look for other grants that align with your project. If you are new to grant writing, the application process can look and feel overwhelming at first. The best way to avoid feeling that way is to do those things I have already talked about, but will reiterate here as they are so important. First and foremost, start early. I can't emphasize this enough, as you will make your grant writing experience so much easier for everyone involved if you give yourself plenty of time to complete the application. Starting early provides you and your staff or volunteers plenty of time to get the information you need and to ask questions as you go through the process. Next, it's important to be organized. Follow the steps I mentioned earlier in the presentation to stay organized by creating a schedule and checklist for yourself, by keeping all of your application components in one folder, and by using Google Docs or a Word document to write your application. And finally, ask questions. Ask questions of your staff. or the professionals you have hired to help you with the project. Also, ask questions of the person who coordinates the grant program you are applying for, as they are typically very helpful too. That ends my presentation for today. If you have any questions specific to the State Historical Society's grant programs, you can reach out to Kristen Vandermolen, who is the Society's grants manager. I will take questions today as time allows, but I can also be contacted with general questions about grant writing using the contact information noted on the screen. Thank you for your participation in the Preserve Iowa Summit and for joining me for my grant writing presentation today.
Thank you, Lisa, on that wonderful presentation. We have quite a few minutes, or a couple minutes, to get into some questions from our audience.
I didn't have a chance to look at those during the presentation. Were there some questions that people asked?
If you guys have any questions, feel free to pop them on in. I do have a few questions for you though, Lisa.
Okay.
How long does a grant writing process typically take for a big project, small projects? How long would you say it takes to complete your grant application?
You know, that varies so much depending on the type of project. I mean, with federal grants, we like to start 6 months out with our planning for that. With some smaller grants, we may start a month out, but some of that depends on your experience with it as well. When I was a newer grant writer, I would need to start the process earlier.
Yes, that makes sense. You know, with any project, you definitely need to be prepared and have as many eyes as you can take a look at your grant. Have you done any recent grants lately that gave you trouble? Any tips that you run into even 20 years later? Any tricks or?
You know, I guess other than what I mentioned in the presentation, I can't think of anything specifically right now, but it is true that each grant application presents its own unique questions. And even when, as long as I've been doing this, I realize still how important it is to start that process early, read through everything, because even if you've applied to the same organization or foundation every year, sometimes things change. They change their application, they change their funding priorities. So it's always important to read through it and not assume it's going to be the same as it was the last time you applied.
Do all the grants show a timeline so that people know how to prepare before they apply?
I would say that they typically don't show a timeline. I mean, they will certainly announce things like the date that they will release the application so that it's available for you to see, and the deadline of when it's due. And with federal grants, they will actually estimate how many hours they anticipate it will take you to prepare the application. So they do provide some of that, but as far as determining for yourself how long it will take you, again, just start earlier than you think you need to. And as you do more of it, you'll get a better feel for how long it will take you to complete an application.
And then maybe something that, you know, after you've really dug in deep for this grant application, how about the thank you afterwards? Is that a common courtesy now? Is that something that you recommend, to a personal letter to the grant?
Yes, yes, that is always important. We send, you know, personally signed letters thanking them when grant funds are awarded, and typically notification if your grant is not awarded is through email, and we always just respond through email thanking them for considering our application, and just trying to keep that line of communication open for hopefully to apply for opportunities in the future, and just be respectful of what they do and the it's, you know, the challenges they face. As I mentioned, they never have enough money to fund all the projects they would really like to fund.
And then I'll do one last question before we go to our final presentation. Are there any resources that identify the focus of particular granting organizations to help you focus your narrative?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Is that question, sorry, is that from one of our
Yeah,
participants?
that is from one of our attendees.
I mean, there's various, if you're looking for guidance on writing grants, there's so much out there. If you just Google grant writing tips, grant writing recommendations, and you can find great resources out there for helping you write your application, for examples of other people's applications, maybe not even for the exact same grant program you're applying for, but just to give you an idea of what somebody else's grant application that was successful looks like. I hope that answers the question.
And if not, you can always rewatch this video and always we can always ask Lisa some questions later as well.
Yes, absolutely.